Hi, everybody, and thanks to all of the speakers who've come before. It's been a very interesting talk so far, and I'm sure that will continue. Our next topic is going to be technology and interoperability, and our first speaker is Dimitrie Stefanescu, so I'm going to hand over to him.
So cool. Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen and that everything is fine. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Ralph, for the reassurance. Digital conferences are weird because you miss all the feedback from actually seeing if your projector is working or if you've got if the audience is yawning or not, yada yada. Anyway, I hope everything is good. So hey everybody, I just wanted today to share with you a bit kind of the story and the context behind Speckle, Speckle being an open source data platform for AEC. And I'm not going to try and sell Speckle too much because we leave that usually for different kind of presentations, but more kind of bring to light the context and research that went behind it. So hi everybody, my name is Dimitrie. I'm a founder at Speckle. I've been in, let's say, in AEC for the past decade as a kind of a design technologist and coder, but also as a kind of down-to-earth like architect. That's my background per se, is architectural engineering. Nevertheless, like I was lucky enough, like a few years back, to grab a stint as a Marie Curie research fellow at UCL that allowed me to kind of investigate digital design communication. Oof. Which, amongst other things, it does include interoperability. And in a sense, Speckle is the result of that research. And it's also kind of a means through which I was able to poke a bit the industry, like, and find out what actually this problem was. My original kind of research focus was very vague. It was on the lines of like, hey, the design process and kind of AEC has a bit of friction in the digital communicative processes that, are holding it back as an industry. There's this digital revolution happening and we don't see AEC kind of benefiting from it. So what's up? That was, in short, the original research assignment. And I guess you're all familiar with the headlines that are on the other side of the slide, so I won't go through them too much, but a lot of people are pointing fingers at bad data recently, right? And data per se, and why didn't productivity grow since, like all other industries benefited from this amazing kind of productivity boost. AEC has not. And one of the questions is like, okay, why? Is it because our industry is just inefficient, or is it stuck in old ways? And I'm using this, maybe controversial GIF to kind of like challenge a bit the audience. I was definitely at the receiving end of what's happening here. So like the guy in the blue shirt moving that toilet around, I was definitely that person early on in my career. So is it just that we're just like totally inefficient, or are we stuck in our old ways? And like I would argue that necessarily that's not 100% the case. So AEC per se is fragmented and it's not integrated. And we know this, it's a given. It's not necessarily like building cars, though a lot of people would want to build buildings like cars are getting built. There's no kind of integration that's fully, solvable. We've seen things like Katera come and go, and there are kind of, though now, like I would like to remark, like this general contractors 2.0 models that are showing up and that are kind of integrating kind of the whole chain of actually building buildings, which is cool. But we're not there yet. And then when it comes to data per se, data, in a sense, there's a political landscape that we're navigating, which is mostly around kind of the software monopolies that exist. Like, I don't need to name any names. And data, when it shuffles around in AEC, it's usually slow and opaque. So it's got a kind of inertia attached to it. It's not transparent. It's not easily queryable. It's kind of stuck in files, in a sense. Nevertheless, kind of, I think there's an underlying problem to that. So when we talk about digital communication, like we kind of lost track of the fact that actually communication is both a social phenomenon as well as a kind of a technical process. And these two things reinforce each other. And if one is missing, if one aspect is missing out of this equation, like the other one suffers as well. And kind of the industry as a whole is kind of not going very well. And that friction that you probably all have felt is kind of revealed. And you can see actually, like surprisingly enough, when I was doing my research at UCL, like if you go through the literature and you look like in what some people call the pre-BIM era, like the prototypical digital design information systems actually evolved from research into how to best manage wicked problems, right? And design per se, like building stuff, is ultimately the ultimate wicked problem, right? And they were looking at how can we help the stakeholders involved to sort out these wicked problems? How can we enable data-informed dialogue in between them? And then slowly with kind of the rise of the BIM era, like you see that there's like a lot of research, and this course actually focuses on technical aspects of communication, like how do we share files, RFIs, so everything becomes very, let's say, bureaucratic in a sense, or becomes increasingly bureaucratic, and the social aspects of communication, which actually are underpinning the whole business, they get lost. They got lost a bit in research. And from my from my time at UCL, like I put out these three kind of main challenges, or this is kind of what emerged as kind of some of the biggest fallacies that we currently have. Some of them are on their way out, which is good, but we're operating at a wrong level of abstraction when it comes to data. So in natural communication, language evolves, right? And enforcing kind of a centralized complete standard, things like IFC, is usually a failed adventure, because as people converse and as they build relationships, so do they kind of optimize the language that they use, right? And that's in a sense why you see things like HTML, for example, right? I'm bringing back technology from the 90s, but it's a composable standards in which anybody can compose their own data structures out of it and, you know, thus create meaning. There's some other kind of like funny aspects that you see when you read all the papers, like the single source of truth fallacy. It's what I call it in a very provocative way, I admit it. And that's another thing, like AC is kind of federated, and in a sense, it's diminishing kind of the capacity of stakeholders, of designers, engineers, BIM managers, and everybody else to curate the information that they need. This is something that people do naturally when it comes to communicative processes. They kind of absorb the information that they need and they curate the data that they need to do their job. So if a structural engineer just needs a structural model, which just represents outlines of floors, slabs, beams, and so on, they will be able to curate that for themselves. And there's a kind of another inherent problem, which is a bit more related to the kind of the political aspect of data in AC or software in AC, which is around data ownership and residency, right? Which by centralizing data and by having kind of only a very few solutions which offer where to store your data, you get to like a kind of a centralized model, which is completely against the nature of the industry. So what you need is a bit of a federated solution. And Speckle kind of was born out of this research. And as I said before, it was both a means to kind of poke the industry, figure out what's wrong, and also respond to actually the information that I was getting. That's why Speckle essentially tries to be a collaborative data platform for the built environment. It's open source. It's because it was born, you know, research was funded by public money. I feel that we should give back to the public, so anybody can take it and run away with it, deploy it on their own servers. And how Speckle works, what it offers as a basis is kind of a cross-vendor interoperability and data exchange layer. And in the process of enabling this, Speckle actually stores this data and normalizes it in its own kind of transparent way. And thus, it kind of also puts it out there for various kind of things that we never imagined people would do, like analysis, collaboration, and a lot of apps can be built on top of Speckle that, you know, like power, like for example, security door analysis in data centers. So there's a lot of kind of a wealth of applications in AC that if data's there, like developers can actually act on it, they can embody and kind of empower the stakeholders to act and take data-informed decisions. And that's kind of a bit about Speckle. That's kind of the product presentation. Like also there's some other kind of key points behind it. They're a bit more technical and a bit more geeky. I added this slide here just so that we don't lose track of them. But it's important to note Speckle is like kind of an object-based version control system. So as opposed to a file-based, system, what Speckle does, it takes files and data and decomposes them into kind of there's substitute atoms, so like in all the little pieces that we can get to. And then it offers up those pieces later down the line for consumption. And this is based on some like magic tricks, secret sauce. That's actually not secret. It's like wide open for everybody to see in our GitHub repositories. And it's, in a sense, it also offers like some aspects around immutability. And this is the same way, like you've seen this in the presentation before mentioned. Actually, immutability is at the core of communication in a sense, because when you think about it, like if you say something, you can't unsay it, right? So Speckle, in a sense, immutability kind of offers the same kind of metaphor, but when it comes to actually to data itself. And this allows for, number one, efficient version control. It allows for also like kind of smart diffing and making things very fast, but it's also kind of a very powerful auditing mechanism, if you think about it, because we always can keep track of who said what and why.
Can you wrap up, Dimitrie?
Yep,
sorry.
I'm wrapping up. This is my last slide, so we're good. And that's about it. Like our mission is to embrace the diversity and richness of the design and construction process. And I'm now really up to seeing like the conversation that will follow. So bam, that's it from me. I'll stop sharing my screen. I hope I press.
Ruth, I think you're on mute.
Cool. Thank you very much, Dimitrie. And now we will move on to the next speaker, John Egan. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Ruth. Can everyone hear me? Yes, I assume so. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can hear you. You can see your screen.
Good stuff. So, hi everyone. My name is John Egan. I'm founder and CEO of BIM Launcher, and I'm here to talk to you today about open information containers and how it will give rise to document interoperability for software used generally to manage our construction projects. So before we start, I like to say files are the currency of a BIM project, but really they are called information containers in context of the BIM standards, and I suppose in in the standard context, it's information containers. Generally, it's what everyone gets paid for, and it's like a stamp in time for the different types of information that some companies might deliver to one another or exchange between one another. So pretty much, this is taken from the Buildings, or not the Buildings Smart, the UK BIM Alliance guidance for ISO 19650, and it shows the model for exchange between different parties on a project. On the right, I've just listed some of the types of documents that are shared on a project. So, you have drawings, ORFIs, change orders, issues, 3D models, and so on. So what this looks like on an actual project, it's I've seen a tweet this morning by Dan Rossiter saying that there was on a project of 30 million, 50,000 information containers are typically exchanged. So it's quite a high frequency of information that we exchange between different organizations on the project and different project management solutions that they're using to manage these documents. One of the biggest challenges is exchanging these information containers between the different systems used on a project. So this is once again from the UK BIM Alliance guidance, where it essentially says, you know, there isn't a standard exchange protocol for exchanging these information containers. And this means that some thought has to go into how an information container and its metadata can be transferred from one system to another. The reality is that the metadata requires re-registration for each information container in the receiving system. So chaos ensues. People end up downloading files, writing the metadata about those, downloading information containers from systems, writing the metadata about those information containers to spreadsheets, and then trying to do manual re-entry into the destination system. Well, you know, obviously this is hugely challenging on a project. It's costly, creates security concerns, increases project risk, and yeah, there's like, obviously it's very wasteful because all of the metadata that was created in the source system is lost as it's translated or as it's moved into the destination system. And you know, this creates a lot of need for rework with the different files or information containers rather. And you know, people resort to using email, FTP service, extranets, Box, file drop services to exchange these information containers. Yeah, so chaos is a word that I think describes it pretty well. So the other means of exchanging information between these different systems is actually attaching the metadata to the information container via its file name. So what we're looking at here is the ISO 19650 file naming convention, and it describes, you know, pretty much every set of digits in this file name represents an equivalent, I suppose an equivalent purpose, or not purpose, but I suppose an equivalent definition, which is typically defined in the BIM execution plan. So if we look at the classification, this is essentially referring to what's the pink arrow. This is essentially saying that the content of this file or the content of this information container refers to the system of framed roof structure systems. The type of document is M3. This needs to be looked up in the BIM execution plans, project defined, and typically would correlate to the uniclass project management or forms of information tables. And some examples for the types is cost plan and method statement, drawing, and so forth. And you can also see.
John, just to let you know, you've got 2 minutes.
Okay, so you can see that there is on the edge of the file name, or on the end of the file name box in the yellow box, we are already requiring that this file name has metadata assigned to this information container, so that the destination or the source and destination systems do not have challenges when it comes to version control of the different information containers. So I suppose the difference of what our tools expect. So for example, this is a Procore specification data model, or a data model for what Procore call a specification. They want these properties. So what we try to do is we try to translate those from the file name into what Procore expects through the API. So it's quite challenging, and obviously there's pieces of information that is missing, such as the issue dates, specification format, and specification section, which only can be manually looked up in the source system before it's created, or before we're actually allowed to create that information container in Procore in this case, maintaining the full integrity of the information container. So what we're proposing here is to present a standard way to define information containers by providing a common data model definition from a shared common set of attributes for each type of information, which is inside these information containers that we exchange on a project. So we're currently engaged with ArcDocs and Maynooth University, and we're undertaking a research project, and we're looking for people to get involved and try and help us to define this common schema for information containers. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was a excellent talk. And now it's time to move on to our last speaker. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So it's really good to be with you today, and thanks a lot for moderating, and thanks a lot for all of the speakers and for Ralph and the team for organizing a great event. So I'm just about to share screen with you. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me. And I mean, it's great to be in company with two people who clearly hate containers and files as much as I do. The topic from my end today is really going to focus on how can the industry move away from spreadsheets to databases and what we should be thinking about in doing so. So I think we all appreciate that poor information flows are hampering construction productivity. We have a lot of processes between a lot of different participants who are sharing information between each other in different ways. And in many ways, what we always hear is BIM is meant to be the solution for this, and geometric models in many ways are always presented in front of everyone as the solution or as one of the key things when it comes to interoperability. But effectively our view and what we've seen in many cases is that a lot of the information exists outside of the 3D model or outside of the geometric model. It is definitely part of the wider project information model, but it's outside of the geometric model. So when we talk about things like teams, organizations, and the stakeholders, the material that we have on site, the costs of the project, even things like the information requirements and product data, a lot of that will lie outside of the geometric model. And in reality, where we'll see a lot of this information is in spreadsheets. So even though when I joined my previous employer, we talk a lot about BIM and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, a lot of the information would be delivered in Excel files or would be manipulated in Excel files. And we'd often really use it as a medium effectively to reconcile information between different sources. But spreadsheets and Excel, from where we're sitting, is at the heart of the problem. It's siloed by default. There are a lot of errors within spreadsheets that are hard to pick up on. They're not consistent and they're not made for collaboration so that multiple people can actually interact on these sheets. They often crash, they lack security, so it's very difficult to tell who's seeing what, and finally they can be quite manual in the way that we're handling them and difficult to access. So you're probably wondering, okay, great, Excel isn't a great medium. What should I use? What are my other alternatives? And if you look at the way that it works right now, there are effectively two categories of solutions. So you either get a dedicated solution for your specific workflow. Examples of that are like Procore and Office. And while they can be good user-friendly solutions, they tend to be really rigid and difficult to customize. They tend to continue being disconnected from the other information sources within the project, and they have limited automation because they're not really tapping into the lowest layer of the data. And then on the other side, you'll see traditional databases, so SQL Server, Postgres, Mongo, and while they can be really powerful too, they tend to be really difficult to use. They're really technical. They're retroactive in nature and not collaborative, and they'll often require a technical or a team or a developer. So at Morto, we really felt that there was a need for a platform that has the familiarity of spreadsheets and documents and the utility of databases. And I think that's quite important because we've seen that every professional can mold the spreadsheet to take the shape of the process that they want. And we felt that we should enable professionals to continue to have that power, but to benefit from some of the emerging technologies that are coming out and benefit from the power of databases. So we offer people a suite of tools effectively that enable them to digitize and connect and automate their processes that have the familiarity of spreadsheets and documents. But then we can use things like APIs to connect to other data sources, and we can use things like webhooks and triggers and scripts to automate workflows. Now, if you've seen solutions like Airtable and Notion, we think they each or have certain weaknesses and aren't fully suited for the construction industry. We're dedicated to the construction industry in every way that we can. And we're extremely focused on connecting data between different sources. That's what we're really trying to enable. So a very good example of that is information management, documents like information requirements and so on and so forth, digitizing them on a database, and then connecting them to other data sources like common data environments, like product data and modeling software, and even like financial data systems and supply chain management systems. And then finally, we can look to automate, and we can automate things like checking the model deliverables and checking the progress of the models. So just to quickly show you what I mean, you can see here the platform effectively, and we have a demo project here that you can see has been structured around ISO 19650. So if I take assessment and need, for instance, I have a section here called project information requirements that I can go into. And this was a resource that was created by the Center of Digital Build Britain as part of a smart standards project that we were doing with them. So I can define things like my information purposes, and you can see that here I'm entering them in a tabular format that's structured.
Mohammad, just to let you know, you've got 2 minutes left.
Perfect, thanks. And then while looking at things like project scope, for example, I can enter text here in the way that I want, and images and so on and so forth. What's key is, while this looks and feels like a document and it can even be exported into Word and PDF, I can structure how this document is created, and I can define the responses that I'd like. So I can define the sections, the descriptions, and the responses that I'll have. And in this case, you can see it's a flexible response, whereas in this case, it's a tabular response. I also wanted to quickly show you in terms of what I just showed you really focused on the documents, but if we start thinking of things like tables and information delivery plans, for instance, this is an example of a master information delivery plan being created on Morto. Again, what's key is all of these columns are completely editable. I can define the name of my column, I can define the type of my column, and I can add as many columns or create a completely blank table from scratch. But the benefit here now is I have the task information delivery plans, each working in a different view that they have access to, the task teams working in a different view that they have access to. And all of this information is automatically being aggregated in the master information delivery plan. I can then connect it to things like my document register from my CDE to start tracking which of my information delivery plan items have actually been delivered or not. I can ultimately end on things like validating and verifying this information. So each of these tables can have rules within them. And here, for example, you'll see that we've imported things like contacts and floors and so on and so forth from Kobe. And I can quickly highlight the errors that I have within any of my sheets based on the rules here. So I shouldn't have a duplicate contact, for instance, and this is why this shows an exclamation mark. So this is a bit of an overview of some of the benefits that we see from moving from spreadsheets effectively to databases that can be customized to meet your specific processes. But what's key is it doesn't stop at information management. It goes beyond, and it can apply to all forms of project documentation from the beginning of the project all the way till the end. And we're really excited to say we have several free tools that can be tested out by the industry. There was one that was developed by the Center of Digital Build Britain for smart standards and ISO 19650 implementation. But I'm also really excited to say that we've been working with ArcDocs on taking their digital plan of work that they had created on Excel and migrating that into a database. So I'll be posting a link later on today for you to sign up for testing it if you'd be interested, and looking forward to participating in the panel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mohammad. That was a great talk. So we have some questions have come in, and the first one is for Dimitrie. There are legacy software, especially in the infrastructure industry, that use the same communication data format. Was Speckle introduced to improve data communication within the Autodesk systems, with taking as example infrastructure projects, which will most likely be fragmented? Can complex data such as roads, geometries be translated using Speckle or between file formats?
That's a long question. In short, yes. And we're not necessarily targeting only the Autodesk ecosystem. Like just last week, we started working on an ArchiCAD integration. We have a Civil 3D integration. And yes, I feel the pain about antiquated software. I think everybody on this call feels it. And when it comes to the structure of data itself, Speckle is very flexible. So yes, you can define a road however you want to define a road, or define a building however you want to define a building. You can put stories inside it, and you can put the walls inside the stories, or you can define the building as walls and put the walls inside, and the walls can have stories assigned to them. So that's one of the things around Speckle. I hope I answered that question. It was a long one.
I think you did. Thank you very much. I have another question, which is, aren't level and location now spatial breakdown and functional breakdown into, wouldn't they now be zones or volumes?
That's for all of us, I hope.
Yes, I think that's probably for all of you.
So I think zones and spatial boundaries, like it's a very tricky question, because from my point of view, and I think it gets about the associated structure in which you put your data. So it can totally be three-dimensional, it can also be purely syntactical, and you can just say this wall is in this zone. It depends on the authoring software as well a lot of times. So there's quite a few answers there, I suspect.
Yeah. Do either John or Mohammad, do either of you have an answer for that question, or is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I definitely reiterate and agree with what Dimitrie just said. I think because I think, if I'm not mistaken, as far as the standard goes, they are within, like, they should be included within file naming conventions, but ultimately it completely depends on your project setup and what's most suitable, and different software works in different ways.
Cool, thank you. So I've got another question here from someone who doesn't necessarily agree that files or data containers are the currency. Surely it's data. Are we not creating the exchange issues by defining a container? Yeah, that's the question. And I think that one is maybe for John.
Yes. I mean, I suppose I have a very one-dimensional view on this. BIM Launcher is used by, government organizations, large contractors, enterprise construction companies, and all we're doing is creating automated workflows around information containers. So whilst we all like to talk about data and data points and all this kind of stuff, the industry isn't there. So that's why I believe that if we can create as a first step, rather than step 4 and 5, which I feel is kind of where the discussion is amongst all of these kind of conferences. As a first step, if we can define one definition of, or represent, well, one definition of common types of information containers that is exchanged between these different systems, it will remove the need to map between proprietary data models representing these information containers in the source and destination systems, and it will reduce the barrier to entry for exchanging these information containers between a plethora of project management tools. And I want this from a selfish perspective, because I want to connect all of the project management solutions on the market, and I suppose that's me.
Yeah, and I can save you, John, because remember on the last AC Hive podcast, we trashed this out a bit, right? And I totally agree that, like, well, we should be there, we're not. So as you say, like, there's a lot of stuff that, is file-based and will continue to be file-based. So that's, it's a currency as well, for sure.
Cool, thank you very much. I've got another question for you, John, which is including the suitability code and revision number in the information container name makes it problematic to revise documents on CDEs. How would you manage that?
Well, it's going to be metadata. So your file name is going to be, we haven't spoken about that. Maybe we continue on with the file naming convention defined in ISO 19650, but so far we've defined 140 different pieces of metadata, not just the suitability and revision code, that would be attributes that would be exchanged as part of the information container and would be defined as part of the information container specification for that information type. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer. Would you, and then I've got a question for everyone, would you say that the current method of appointment detracts from the data value, for example, MEP contractor appointed post-tender rather than creating a design construction team?
Who wants to go first?
Happy to. I think, like, just generally speaking, getting the supply chain involved as early as possible in providing feedback on information requirements, for instance, is really important. Some of the most successful projects that we're on have been doing that and have been engaging supply chain early, and I'm pretty sure that everyone will be with me on this, that's what we should all be moving to.
Yeah, 100%. I can't echo this enough. Like, I remember back in the day when I was still doing buildings and drawing stuff, like the amount of work that was thrown out the door because we didn't talk with the manufacturer in time was crazy. And like, just actually being able to get it, like, can we actually afford this? Resolved before, like, you had like 10 architectural interns thrashing out plans would be brilliant, right? Just from that point of view. John.
I have no comment.
Cool. Then there's another question here, which is very interesting. And again, I think this is probably for all of you. Do you think that the software monopoly and rate of development of BIM softwares are interrelated? And I'm going to suggest maybe Dimitrie starts that one.
Yeah, in a sense, yes, they're obviously interrelated. Whenever you have like, I mean, monopolies in general are bad for innovation, you know, and that's why I'm happy to be on this panel with people like John, with people like Mo, that are like kind of trying to, you know, shuffle things around and introduce noise in the system, because I think this is what's needed right now. So yeah, that's it.
I think even like commenting on earlier what like we were talking about with relation to interoperability, like all you need is just people to sit in a room and start talking to each other, and they're unlikely to do that if it benefits their monopolies. And I think like all three of us here have taken a really open approach to the way we work, generally speaking, and allowing people to move data between systems and so on and so forth. And I think increasingly that's where we're going to move, and the big monopolies will at some point have to shift.
Hopefully.
And I would say that I think that there's healthy competition between all of the vendors in the construction space, and there's no monopoly. So I don't, yeah, kind of nip that in the bud, but I did read an interesting article about how there is one, I suppose, venture capitalist company that has a vested interest in all of the different
I think
vendors. Yeah. So that's but I think we'd have to jump into that and really start to examine it in order to kind of, I suppose, come to some sort of conclusion there. But I don't think, yeah, it's all competition in my view, at least.
Yeah, I mean, there is competition. There isn't. Yeah, I don't know. It's though, like, I do feel, I think maybe monopoly in that case could be a wrong term. You could say like maybe like a, I don't know, an industry that exists for a long time, and there's a bunch of old like stuff that keeps on carrying over from back in the day. But yeah, okay, sorry, I'll stop ranting. I'm prone to do that.
Very interesting points there. So I think I've got a couple of final questions here. The first one is for Mohammad. They have said that they assume that BIM is delivering information rather than a spreadsheet. Would that mean Airtable delivers information way better than any other system?
Yeah, so Airtable is, I mean, I definitely wouldn't say it's better than any other system. It's better in what it does for tabular information than a lot of systems out there. Now, I'm very biased. We are a competitor to Airtable, so I will definitely tell you that we're the better choice. When it comes to, I definitely though generally think that databases are a better mechanism for handling tabular data and ultimately linking them to the other models that you do have within a project. As for how we're different to Airtable, we focus a lot on documents and embedding the table views within documents. We focus a lot on process delivery, and we focus much more on automation and connecting to construction data sets. But I would definitely agree that Airtable is better than a spreadsheet any day.
Cool, thank you very much. And the final question is going to be for John. And it is that the asker uses ProjectWise in their company as their CDE, and they're migrating to join BIM 360. Which platforms your company is analysed? Which platforms is your company analysing in terms of CDE transition?
Well, typically we support the use case of migrating the data from one system to another. So, like we've just finished a project where we've moved a full organization's data from Connect to Procore, and it was 10 terabytes of data in total. So moving from ProjectWise to BIM 360 is not a challenge. We already support Autodesk, and we're in discussions with ProjectWise. So I encourage the question or the person asking the question to get in touch, and we can talk about that in more detail.
Cool, thank you very much. Well, I think that is time to wrap up our session on technology interoperability. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. It's been very interesting.
Thanks.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.